2, and we are live. So welcome to Seinfeld, RWJ Medical School. We're here with the Cigar Store Indian episode. So, who's up first?
I think George.
George, yeah.
Yeah. George? What's going on with George?
So George at this point is living back with his parents. His parents are away on vacation, I believe, and he's there with George. It's George and obviously Kramer, Jerry, and Elaine, and they're like getting the house kind of ready or something. And I think Jerry was the one who put a coffee mug directly on the coffee table and left the state, and this caused George to freak out essentially because he couldn't have friends or couldn't have a party while his parents were away. So he went through an elaborate thing where he tried to get the coffee table refurbished, and hilarity ensues.
So, what defense mechanism do you think is in play when we see George react the way he does, specifically saying that he's not allowed to have friends over when his parents are out far away? Regression, right? So George is regressing. Because of what happens next, because of what is the highlight of a subplot here in the Cigar Store Indian episode, what age do you think George regresses to and why?
Teenage years.
Teenage years? Well, what are you talking about? What happens here?
Well, he has a lady friend over.
He does.
And they engage in activities.
Where?
In his parents' bedroom.
So, from a Freudian perspective, can you shed some light as to George's behavior?
This is like the genital stage. Right?
Close.
Oh.
Phallic.
Phallic.
And what complex is resolved in the phallic stage?
Edible complex.
Edible complex. So probably now. I mean, you really can't disagree with this being adolescent behavior. However, if you're going to stick strictly to the Freudian psychosexual stages of development, this is around 4 or 5 years of age that George regresses back to, as evidenced by his unresolved Oedipal complex. That is, his actually having sex in his parents' bed, his wanting to possess his mother. Right? Now, if you were Larry David, or I think more cleverly, if Larry David called us about editing this episode, what might we add into the plot for George Costanza, and perhaps specifically a family member of George Costanza, now knowing what we know?
Something involving George's father and
what would need to involve George's father?
Maybe like putting a picture frame with him down or something like that.
And what would that be? What would, in your mind, that be symbolic of?
Like representing sort of him moving his father out of the family picture, getting him out of the way so that he's free to.
You said everything.
Which is the rivalry.
Kill his father. You said everything but the word kill. Because that was a prophecy.
Right.
Right. That was the prophecy. So yes, exactly right though. So you've gone mild. You're going to just put George Costanza, Mr. Costanza's Frank's picture down, okay? But the idea is perfect, right? You're going to kill Mr. Costanza. Exactly. So Larry David just missed. Any other ideas with regard to George Costanza's behavior and how it could owe to some teaching points in psychiatry? Anybody else in this episode worthy of our analysis? No?
Jerry.
What's going on with Jerry?
He goes to the cigar shop, or the table, wherever, with George, and he finds this Indian cigar thing and decides to buy it for Elaine as an apology gift, but the motivation is more driven to show that he's like this great person so he can attract one of her friends whose name I forgot. Winona, who ends up being Native American herself. And then he offends her, and then as a result of that tries to make up for it by I guess trying to be very like politically correct with all his statements that he's making throughout the entire remainder of the episode.
Is it your impression that he is trying to make up with her for altruistic reasons. That is, if the date was off the table,
No, absolutely.
would he have gone through the effort that he has gone
No.
through? That he
No.
knows.
No.
Okay, so, from that perspective, what are some of the clinical terms we may use to describe Jerry with regard to his efforts to get on Winona's good side and undo the harm he may have caused, the undue stress he may have caused?
Lack of remorse.
Lack of remorse, right? What else? I agree.
Deceitfulness.
Huh? So, unfortunately, or fortunately, you just described two clinical terms that are literally in the definition of what illness. Antisocial personality. It's unfortunate. Now, I mean, we do get some glimpses of Jerry's early developmental history. There's nothing to suggest that there was any fire setting or cruelty to animals. That is, no signs or symptoms that might have been suggestive of conduct disorder. So I think he's going to fall short of that diagnosis. There is, however, some etiology here that probably is ingrained in his early childhood experiences, however, and it's that probably is defined through his incapacity to see any situation through anyone else's eyes but his own. What clinical term is used to describe that phenomenon? Inability or incapacity to process a situation through anyone else's eyes but one's own. Egocentrism. And while egocentrism definitely is part of the etiology of the antisocial personality, it is also part of the etiologies of all of the cluster B personality disorders. So, other than antisocial, what are the other cluster B personalities?
Narcissistic,
Narcissistic,
histrionic, and borderline.
Rattle those off. You're getting your mid-rotation? Halfway there. All right, so whether or not Jerry truly has one of these illnesses, I don't know. However, he does have the risk factor of egocentrism. And I think that's manifest here with regard to how he interacts with Winona. All right, any other characters here?
The guy Elaine meets on the subway.
From Strauss test.
Yeah.
What happens there?
So Elaine is on the subway and is reading the TV guide because Jerry was supposed to drive her home, but then she was taking the subway and she has like nothing to read, so she takes one of George's father's TV guides and is reading it, and then somehow, I forget exactly how, but she ends up giving it to this guy that she meets on the subway, and he was very taken by her. And so then he makes the TV guide into a bouquet of flowers and finds the address for the TV guide as George's parents. And so then he shows up at their house with this bouquet of flowers for Elaine.
Okay. So what's your differential diagnosis here?
Schizotypal personality.
Comes up as a cluster A.
Yeah.
And not to put words in your mouth, but he does seem to demonstrate some element of social awkwardness.
Mm-hmm.
So cluster A. Do you think he's paranoid?
No.
Yeah. So it might be schizotypal cluster.
Yeah.
But for a schizoid, I wouldn't expect him to
Go
to someone's house to try to make a more extensive relationship with them.
True. That does weigh against it. It certainly does weigh against it. Any other potential diagnosis here?
We can't rule out autism spectrum disorder.
Some spectrum, right? So we may have some cognitive,
Mm-hmm.
and more specifically, cognitive communication deficit in terms of what we recognize, what we observe.
Social norms.
The other concern I would have is stalking. Now, that's not a DSM diagnosis, but you're going to be in a paraphilia. This might be a sexual deviancy. Right? Now, if it happens of one and done, and even if it doesn't, it may actually rise to the level of a crime, but not necessarily to the level of a mental disorder. So the two are tricky, and one is not mutually exclusive of the other. So we have to keep our psychiatry hat on. Whether or not he's breaking the law is irrelevant to us in terms of making a diagnosis. But we have to think of a paraphilia, that is a sexual deviancy, and get to why he's doing what he's doing. Anything else here with Elaine? Elaine's character. The other part of this, in terms of which he gets wrapped up in, is the TV guide issue. What disorder might Frank Costanza demonstrate with regard to his obsession?
Hoarding.
Yeah, right. So he used the word obsession. Hoarding disorder was actually part of obsessive compulsive disorder as recent as the DSM-4. But because of how common it was, the DSM task force or the APA task force moved it out of OCD and created its own disorder, hoarding disorder. So, I mean, Frank may have to be worked up for that. Anything else here? The only other thing I wrote down was Jerry's argument with the postal worker. What happens there?
So Jerry was trying to woo Winona, and he was asking her to go basically somewhere to eat, and he knows like this great Chinese place, and wasn't quite sure where it was in the neighborhood, and he asked the postal worker, hey, do you, obviously you know where this place is, and the actual postal worker was Chinese or Asian descent, and basically goes on a tirade about saying, oh, you know, how dare you think I know this because I'm Asian, and that type of, you know, things.
What I found interesting about the scene is even if you take Jerry's perspective and focus on the fact that Jerry asked because he was a postal worker, not because of his ethnicity, there is still a door to investigate Jerry's prejudice and therefore his cognitive dissonance. That is, identifying him as a postal worker, sure, he might know the neighborhood better, but we also know from previous episodes, and since this is only season 5, 4 seasons of subsequent episodes, is that Jerry is prejudiced against postal workers because of his interaction with Newman, and to that extent may actually be demonstrating stigma of mental illness, because he brings it up to Newman more than one occasion about his being mentally ill due to the fact that he's a postal worker. So this might be a little bit more complex. Even if we do, quote unquote, side with Jerry and think there's nothing to this, this is comical, this was a misunderstanding, and because of it, it's funny. Well, if Jerry is focused on the fact that this gentleman is a postal worker, it actually might be deeper than just that.
Isn't that like where the term like going postal comes from?
Right. Going postal is the U.S. term for what? Culturally bound syndrome. Where an individual with no signs of prior mental disorder actually has an abrupt episode that winds up in a spree that includes not only harm to others, but on significant occasion, ultimately suicide.
Or amok.
Amok, exactly right. Amok. And the irony here, and this is where Larry David gets it right, what particular culture does amok stem from? Asian. Yeah. So Larry David, perhaps by chance, but maybe not, actually did some investigating on Kaplan and Sadok and got this one right in a very roundabout way. Very interesting that he actually chooses someone of Asian descent to demonstrate amok, albeit loosely, at least in Jerry's mind. Any other culturally bound syndromes that come to mind? Not necessarily describing what Jerry demonstrates, but just that you've heard of, studied, that might appear on your examination. We'll end this morning's conversation with these rare illnesses. And these illnesses are getting more and more rare because of urbanization and because of diversity and because of the melting pot. These cultures are no longer singular or geographically isolated in 2018. So in clinical practice, we hardly see them anymore, but they do still appear on shelf exams, at least through historical interest. Good. What is that going to look like? Yeah.
I know, it's like in the Latino culture.
Yep. So 3 things you have to know, and that's one of them. You've got to recognize Latino culture on your exam. Puts them at risk for ataque de nervios. What are the other 2?
There's like the somatic disorder in Korean culture.
Oh, I'm sorry, wait. Don't get there yet. What are the other 2 parts of ataque that you have to know to get it right on your exam? Number 2, it looks like a panic attack. Right? And number 3, the one distinguishing characteristic that almost universally comes up on shelf exams where panic disorder won't be the single best answer is that there's a report of a heat sensation that begins perhaps in the abdomen and rises to the head. That seems pathognomonic. So Latino, panic attack, and then that distinguishing characteristic, ataque de nervios, single best answer. Okay, next one.
A somatic disorder, I can't remember the name, starts with
You're
a
put us on the
D.
spot now.
I know, but it's in Korean culture. It's like beyond. I don't know. I don't want to like say it correctly.
Taking it up.
Yeah. Man.
It's on the slides yesterday.
No, it wasn't. It was on a question that Omo had done.
Calling people out now. Text her.
Except Omo's not here, so it's fine. Oh man. It's in Korean culture.
Oh, why are you looking it up? Any other ones?
Hwabyung. Hwabyung. I probably butchered that. But it's a somatic disorder. And in South Korean culture.
South Korean culture, somatic disorder. Okay. Any others?
There's one where patients feel like their penis is shrinking and disappearing. I forgot what it's called. Is it African
What is it?
culture? I forgot what it's called.
Anybody? Cobra. African Asia. Any others? How about one that is within the borders of the US, comes up on shelf exams? It's called root work or hoodoo. The use of spells to keep away evil spirits. Somebody travels from the bayou of Louisiana, gets off at North Liberty, and comes to the attention of TSA. Because if they're putting brick dust down around them in a terminal as soon as they get off the plane, TSA gets the proper authorities where the individual then hits the turnpike south, the Piscataway exit, Route 18, right to acute psychiatric services, and you are on call. What do you do? At this point in your differential, what's the first thing that should be on your mind? Choice A, normal behavior. That's got to be your starting point. And unless there is danger to self or others, that likely will be your end point. That this is root work, this is hoodoo, this is normal for their culture, and therefore when they step away from their region, their isolated region, it is still normal, unless it poses an imminent risk to self or others. And having said that, not only imminent risk, I only say imminent risk because you're in the APS, which is where your focus is going to be. If it's clinically significant, it's still going to be a problem, right? Having said that, this condition, root work or hoodoo, then becomes or gets relabeled as a culturally sanctioned belief, which is distinguished from a culturally bound syndrome. Both of these instances are geographically isolated, at least on paper. In one situation, hoodoo, it's normal. It's culturally sanctioned. In the other situation, even though it is geographically isolated, it's considered to be abnormal in that particular culture. So it's a culturally bound syndrome. That's what differentiates one from the other. You could see either. On your shelf exam and in real life, for the culturally bound syndromes, you are likely going to be asked the single best diagnosis. You've got to know terms like ataque de nervios, cobra. On the other hand, when you see a condition like hoodoo, it's about 50-50. Half the time you're going to be asked to label the condition, root work or hoodoo. But in the other half, they're going to ask you the next best step, which is going to be do nothing, reassure, or normal behavior. So there you might be asked on a coin flip, one or the other. If you want to review root work, nice movie to watch. I mean, and it puts you in a situation of being that clinician, that evaluator of what is going on here. Skeleton Key. Very underrated movie. It's also one of the top, arguably one of the top 5 movies all time with dramatic twist or plot endings at the end, plot twists at the end. I dare ask you what the other four are. Well, I'll pose that question off camera, and we can discuss throughout the rest of the day. What makes your top 5 list, plot twists at the end? Hold that thought again. By 4 o'clock today, I want your list. Any other thoughts, getting back to the Cigar Store Indian?
Just regarding the heroes, does it just show the impulsive nature of basically like a Elaine Kramer? Because who on earth would go on a train and decide, I really want that hero, and run out of the train and come back really quickly or get your arm stuck?
Right. So let's actually take that into context of what we we're just talking about. So with that in mind, any thoughts? Because I think from one perspective, you're right. And it clearly causes Kramer some clinically significant distress.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it actually causes Elaine some distress as well. Mm-hmm. So maybe this is impulsivity that's rising to the level of needing to come to clinical consideration. On the other hand, if you are a particular subculture, i.e. a New Yorker, this might be average everyday behavior.
Because Jerry does it too, it's not just Kramer. Jerry goes and does the same exact thing. So I just felt like it was...
Perfect scene to discuss exactly what we're talking about. Not necessarily voodoo, there's no brick dust being laid down per se. However, is this culturally sanctioned? Not a big subway driver myself. No, mass transit is kind of not quite what it is in New Jersey as compared to New York.
Yeah.
Having said that, though, I can actually see myself jumping out of that train. I have to be honest with you. Right? I'm on a subway. And off camera, remind me to tell you another, just to verify this very story. But if that's got to be off camera, and there's no way I'll put it. I'll turn my cell phone off, put on airplane mode. All right. Anything else here? We're good? All right, so we'll come back on Tuesday morning. I will tweet this, but the next episode, episode 11, season 5, will be the conversion. And the last thing before I go, just an FYI, if you have nothing else better to do this weekend, the Cigar Store Indian is also something that appears, the actual totem actually appears in an old drama mystery, maybe in horror, called The Night Stalker, right, 1972. It was a TV show that was adapted after 2 films called The Night Stalker. I won't tell you exactly what happened with regard to the episode that has the Cigar Store Indian. It was like every other episode, it's creepy. But I just wanted to make that reference. If you ever catch some of these episodes, they're not really re-aired. I think you have to actually look for them. They're produced by Matheson, who happened to be the novelist of I Am Legend. So it's part of his work. All right. We'll see you on Tuesday. Everybody have a great day around.